Representative Candelora, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this budget document. I think of the old adage of those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I'd like to take us down memory lane a little bit. In 2008, when the bottom dropped out of Connecticut's revenue, we were struggling with trying to put together a budget. And so what we did is we looked to a number of changes over the course of many years to try to fix the problem. And all of those changes revolved around transparency. You know, we actually had a time not long ago when we didn't even know what was in our checkbook. And so we started with developing a cash flow report that told us what was in our checkbook. There was actually a time when Connecticut was cutting checks and we weren't sure if we could cash them. Our accounts were near zero. That transparency brought us to a better understanding of our budgeting, so much so that in, I think, 2009, we created the consensus revenue. The consensus revenue reports came out of the anger of Democrats when the Governor Rell at the time proposed a budget. Revenues changed from the time in February that she proposed a budget to the time the Appropriations Committee presented a budget. And Democrats demanded that the governor needed to readjust her budget. And she didn't, because she fulfilled her obligation of providing a budget. And so what was born was the consensus revenue that required every quarter for us to understand where our revenues are so that we knew each step of the way where Connecticut was going. And then it all culminated in 2017 when we were at an impasse on our budget and we created the fiscal guardrails. We codified our constitutional spending cap, we created the revenue cap, and we created the volatility cap because we recognized Connecticut was in dire straits. We were at a time in 2018 where we were actually cutting ECS funds. And so I know there was discussion in the chamber that this document is protecting ECS, but I could pretty confidently say you are protecting nothing in this document, in this vote today. Why? If you go to Section 5 of this budget, you are authorizing the governor to cut $129 million from any state agency in the state of Connecticut. Ladies and gentlemen, that is what's called a lapse. On top of that authority, you're giving him an additional $48 million in change to cut from next year, the 2025 budget. So what does that mean? Well, that means he could go to any fund possible. He could go to municipal aid, he could go to ECS, he could go to DCF, he could go to any agency to make these reductions. And the reason I know this is because it's happened before. So in 2018, when we didn't have, or in 2017, we didn't have a budget, Governor Malloy cut all of our town's ECS midway through the process, and we all panicked. And what came out of that was a piece of legislation in 2018. It was Public Act 18-35. And what it did was expressly prohibited the governor from cutting ECS. And when it went through the public hearing process, our OPM secretary, of course, testified against the bill, recognizing that they needed every tool in their toolbox to balance the budget because we didn't have a budget. And guess what one of those tools were? The ability to lapse money. The very thing that you are putting in this document in Section 5. So what happened when this legislation was passed? Well, the governor vetoed it. Despite many senators upstairs co-sponsoring it, they failed to override the veto. So unfortunately, it created that impasse, put us into the room, we created the fiscal guardrails. Unfortunately, we hadn't come back to look at it again. The conscious decision to ignore this process as a budget process and to cede all authority to this governor is potentially setting every single one of our communities up for this same scenario. Sort of reminded of that old game that we used to play as a kid, the Wonder Ball goes round and round. And it was so exciting to play as a kid. You never know when that ball's gonna stop and if you're gonna get stuck with it and you try to throw it really quick. Then you argue who is stuck with that ball. Well, Section 5 is gonna be that Wonder Ball for every one of us in this room. So I will say, those of you supporting it, it's a pretty steep price to pay, potentially. I'm also reminded of the old adage of sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Well, I think we're testing that theory today, because names do hurt. By coming up with these words of stabilization and authorization and reappropriation, you're avoiding the important word of budget. And why? Because, again, we're avoiding the calculation of our guardrails. And so there's already been remarks this year of we need to change them, they're too rigid. The stage is already being set to violate these guardrails. The very guardrail is that we all voted for unanimously last year. It was the first order of business out of the gate. We reaffirmed them. And now we are completely ignoring them. And that transparency we fought so hard to bring into this budgeting process, we are putting a cloak right over this process. So we have no idea if this violates the spending cap. We have no idea if it violates the revenue cap. And we're going to leave it up to this governor to figure out what $200 million is going to be cut. Where is that Wonder Ball going to be going? And because I don't have this transparency, I also am reminded of a childhood game of, blind man's bluff. Used to love going downstairs. We'd actually turn off all the lights to make it even darker, put a blindfold on somebody, and then we would hide around the room. And it was always fun until somebody ran into that wall and banged their head. But there was always an adult in the room that would come downstairs, patch things up, and make sure we didn't do it again. And sometimes we would sneak down anyway because we'd forget and we would do it all over again. We'd bang our head again. And I'm looking for that adult who would come in this room and tell us, don't do it again. And I'm still waiting for that adult, sadly. Because I don't think any of us in this room realize the ramifications of what we're doing today. And I know it's a difficult vote for people because there's a lot of stuff in here for our communities. And there's optics. We want to go home to our districts to say, we brought home X, we brought home Y, I took care of you. But is it really worth it? Is it really worth throwing this process out the window and going back to playing these childhood games of the Wonder Ball and blind man's bluff? I don't think so. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I am not going to be supporting this budget. And I understand on this side of the aisle there are some people that are contemplating potentially supporting it. But to be clear, however this vote goes, as the leader of this caucus, this is not a process that we have endorsed, even if people support it. Thank you.